Welcome to TNT Episode 5. Today's topic, Chronicles of Narnia, Book 1.
Now, you just said we're going to cover Book 1,
Mm-hmm.
but we already covered Book 1 last time. Remember Book 1, The Magician's Nephew?
You mean Book 6, The Magician's Nephew?
Oh, we're back to this. We
Yes.
still don't even know what Book 1 is.
Well,
So,
I do.
okay.
It's
so
just you who are confused. And C.S. Lewis, he's confused too.
He's confused again. What does he know? He just wrote them. But anyway, Taylor wants to tell us his supposed reasons for
Yes.
why The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the book we're going to cover today, should actually be read as Book 1.
And I'm not going to waste a bunch of time on this. I just wanted to give a few words.
Okay.
First of all, when I first read it, actually it was my mom who read it to me. We got this big old anthology of all the Chronicles of Narnia books, and so she read them aloud to me and my siblings, and she started from The Magician's Nephew. With that in mind, it's not from, you can't just say, oh, it's just because of nostalgia that you're reading this, which is what people would tend to say.
Oh, because you actually did
I
start
actually
with the
started with The Magician's Nephew.
Okay.
So, of course, there's just the fact he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, so there's, even if he could go back and write a book that came before it, that's still what he wrote first with the beginning of a story in mind. So it is, as we're going to see today, it is a valid starting point. He wrote it to be a valid starting point for a series.
Nice.
And even though he's said, as we saw last week, I didn't think that there was going to be... It pretty much ends like... The last few lines kind of sound like he was planning on something. And so he wrote it as a story in and of itself and the beginning to a series. And what I feel is it's almost like how you would say if somebody was either going to start reading the New Testament Gospel or the Old Testament creation story first, you would tell them to read the Gospel first because that's where the really essential information is. So it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that we see Aslan's character, and we get introduced to the main characters for a good part of the series. And even though we're not getting an explanation as to why the world works, we're seeing how it works. I do think that The Magician's Nephew is a good book, and I would definitely recommend reading it after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but you really, I feel at least, that you get a better idea of Aslan's character.
Right.
It's more of a fairy tale. It feels it doesn't really matter how the world works at this point. You're getting to know the people in the world. And while The Magician's Nephew is good for explaining everything about it, I feel like it would be more beneficial for somebody coming into the series to come into it more easing into it than being pushed a bunch of information. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this, people who are...
You've got to settle this for us because there's just these two different views that people have. We'd love to hear which do you think is better to read first.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there's no definite set way you have to do it. But those are some good points that Taylor made. So if you're going to follow his advice, read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as Book 1.
Just make sure you read both The Magician's Nephew and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Regardless of the order, read them both.
Mhm.
But yeah, this could be a good Book 1. for
Either
a lot of
one
people.
could
Yep.
work, depending on whichever one you pick up. Even C.S. Lewis
Read
didn't
it.
really know
Read it
which
is the
one
key.
you should.
I'd like to talk now about how C.S. Lewis originally wrote this story and dedicated it to a girl named Lucy Barfield. And I'd like to read the dedication at the beginning of the book because it gives you a little bit about what C.S. Lewis, it kind of shows a little bit about what C.S. Lewis is like. He says, "My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear, and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis." You really get a little bit of his personality coming out in that dedication. That's a really good thing to see before you even read the story.
Yeah. And Lucy Barfield really didn't have a very easy life. She was pretty sick was it multiple sclerosis for most of her life, and a lot of her family members died before she did, but throughout her life, these books were a very strong source of comfort for her. So it's nice to see that they did what they were intended to.
It shows you that personal side and the effect that the books can have on people in a positive way. Well, let's get into the story itself, and let's begin with just introducing the characters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So let's list them off here. We've got the main children characters, Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter.
Lucy is obviously a nod to Lucy Barfield.
Oh yeah, did you notice? It's the same name as who the book was dedicated to. Yeah, so there's Lucy, and their last name is Pevensey. Then they are living in this story with a professor in the country, and this professor's name happens to be Diggory.
You may recognize him from The Magician's Nephew.
Only if you've read The Magician's Nephew first, which you just told everybody not to do.
They will, however, have watched our video, so they should know who he is from that.
Now we got to decide, should you watch that video first, or should you watch this video?
They said listen to our video as they're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That way they get the best of both worlds. So there's Professor Diggory, there's Mrs. McCready, who is the housekeeper at the house in the country. There's the White Witch. There's Aslan, the lion. And there are also various talking animals. Well, in case people aren't familiar with the story, actually, how could they not be familiar with this story? Yeah, especially
now that the movies are out.
Yeah, they kind of there were actually some older versions of movies. The British Broadcasting Company did some old movies, and
the first memory I have of this story was a cartoon that I watched in grade school. And I found out today that it was actually produced in 1979, which is that's the year I was born.
And it was pretty faithful to the books, but that animation, it could be pretty creepy at times.
Well, it sticks with you, and it tells the story. It tells the story. Tells the story is the important thing. So let's talk about the story itself. And something I want to mention, according to my official Narnia chronology, is that we are actually going to be looking in this story at the years of Narnia 1000 to 1014. That's when this story takes place.
So 1000 years have passed since
the creation
Narnia came about. Which really isn't that long if you think about the span of history.
Not to Taylor. That's like 1,000 years. That's nothing. But a lot has changed in Narnia in that 1,000 years. So let's talk about the plot. What actually happens in this story?
Well, we start out with just a few brief words about how the children had been sent off to live with a professor in the middle of the countryside because of the air raids on London. No explanation as to why they're being sent to that particular professor. But they don't even mention the professor's name in the book. Yeah, and even if you had read The Magician's Nephew first, you wouldn't know it was Diggory.
He may not have even created the professor's name at this point.
I'm sure he didn't.
Right. So they go to live with a professor in the country, and the real gist of the story is that they enter the world of Narnia through a magic wardrobe.
Which you would find out a little bit more about that if you had read The Magician's Nephew also.
But they haven't, because...
They haven't read the book. I don't think they ever read the book.
No, and they're not going to read that one first if they follow your advice.
You see, I'm not very consistent.
You have no idea where this wardrobe comes from.
I want all the convenience of The Magician's Nephew with all the otherness of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
With all the benefits of reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, which you outlined so eloquently earlier. Let's get back to the story. They go through the magic wardrobe, they enter the land of Narnia, and when the children come out into the land of Narnia, it's very different from how it was before.
Inside of a wardrobe?
Yeah, it's very different.
And the way that it was before.
But They see that the whole land is now in a perpetual winter. It actually kind of reminds me of our weather right now.
Yeah.
We're in March, but I think last night was like still negative 14 degrees. I
Yeah.
feel as if we're in a perpetual winter enchanted by the White
Well,
Witch.
we are in New England, so basically.
Yeah, it's almost the same. You can really relate to the books in
It could
that
be
way.
summer for all we know.
So when the children are in this land, they learn about two different people, or characters, I guess we should say. One is not actually a person at all. They find out he's a lion and his name is Aslan. And when they hear about Aslan for the first time, it creates different effects in them.
It's
And
interesting that it goes in C.S. Lewis, he describes the emotions going through each of their heads.
yes, and good emotions
Uh-huh.
for most of the children. But it's interesting, Edmund, who kind of has a real unique part of the plot, he doesn't have a good reaction.
Mhm.
He actually feels quite
It's like a
guilty
mixture
when
of
he thinks.
guilty, fear, and
Yeah.
annoyance.
Yeah,
It's like there's a little bit of anger in there, too.
yeah. He has that animosity. So there's Aslan, the really good central character, and then the one who embodies evil, as we talked about in our last episode, is this woman, Jadis, who in this story is...
I don't even think they refer to her by that name in
No,
this, do they?
Not in this one, I don't think. It's just
In fact,
the
you may
White
even-
Witch.
It could even be possible to not even draw the connection, even reading The Magician's Nephew first.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I don't even remember where we get the connection that she is, in fact, the witch from the beginning. I mean, if you listen to the Focus on the Family audiobooks, she's done by the same voice actress, but
There's
they
the
didn't. That doesn't
Or
really
if you
mean
watch the
anything.
movie, you always see the same person. In
Yeah.
I think the real connection is her looks, and you see that she's this very powerful,
Mm-hmm.
tall, strong woman. And now she looks different. She's white.
Yeah.
Her lips are very red.
I guess you were getting the beginning of that transformation at the end of The Magician's Nephew, so I
That's
guess
right.
that would be the connection.
That's the connection. Plus, she's evil.
She's evil. Now, when Edmund first entered Narnia, separate from the other children before most of them, Lucy was the first one, and then she came back, and she told the other children they didn't believe her because, like, can you really expect they'd believe, I just walked through a wardrobe into a magical land where I did magical things, but now I'm back. Like, yeah, that's fine, Lucy, just, now go play.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, the professor believes
Yes.
that it could be true.
Mhm. As you would see the connection with the... Okay, I gotta
Yeah.
stop with this.
So many
So,
connections.
Edmund accidentally walks through a wardrobe into Narnia by himself, where he meets the White Witch. That was very matter of chance, I guess.
And he is tempted by the White Witch with something called Turkish Delight.
Turkish Delight. You wouldn't
Which
believe
we
how
have
hard it is to
here.
find it. We managed to
And
find
I
it at
actually
TJ
am
Maxx, actually.
Really interested in eating some of this right now.
Oh, it will steal your
okay,
soul.
Okay.
It is like the embodiment of sin in this book.
So he gets tempted to eat this. He
Mhm.
eats it. It's enchanted, and he doesn't want to stop. And that temptation that he gives into ultimately turns him over to. He just wants constantly to have more of this Turkish delight, and so he really succumbs to the power of the White Witch, and he really ends up being on her side.
So when the children all together come into Narnia, and they are actually met by some friendly beavers who tell them about this prophecy
Because
about
beavers
how...
are good.
Because
of
beavers,
course.
they're cuddly and cute creatures, which in Narnia means they have to be
They're
good.
good.
So they're told about this prophecy about 4 children who will become kings and queens and restore Narnia to the way it's supposed to be as
Right.
Aslan comes.
Not winter anymore,
Right.
but finally the spring and the warmth and the
Yes.
foliage and all the beauty will come back.
And so the beavers tell them about Aslan, and it evokes a different emotion in each of the children. It's pretty much something good in most of the children, but then it comes to Edmund, and he's tainted by the White Witch,
Yes.
and not necessarily just what she gave him, but the fact that he gave into it and that he just was lusting for more, and the mindset that he put himself into, that he was already of a mind to betray his siblings.
Yep.
And so this causes him to feel guilty and kind of fearful and angry. And so then he decides, alright, I can't take anymore. I'm going to go to the White Witch. And so he leaves without them noticing, and he travels to where the White Witch told him she could find him, and he's just, the whole time he's telling himself, oh, she's not as bad as they're saying.
He keeps justifying what he's doing, but he's actually going to be, committing treachery, and he ends up going to the White Witch and giving away their plans, which they were planning to meet Aslan at the stone table. He gives away the plans and tells the witch that Aslan has arrived.
Which horrifies her.
Yeah, she's really upset by that. And then she begins to treat Edmund very, very badly.
Which makes him kind of regret.
Yeah, he's starting to regret and feel bad.
As the rest of the children meet up with Aslan, and he assures them, even though your brother did this horrible thing, we're still going to rescue him.
Yes.
And that ends up a success, and Edmund and Aslan share a moment, and Edmund repents, and Aslan says, don't bring it up again, it's past.
Yes, but the story's not over there, because there still seems to be a problem. The witch ends up coming and meeting with Aslan and saying, you owe me a life because of the treachery committed. And it's interesting, there's a deep magic that she talks about that says in order for that deep magic to be appeased, she deserves a life. So it's almost like there's a death, and you mentioned her representing evil. There's a death that needs to happen because Edmund has committed treachery and has turned against the side of good. And
Aslan has to acknowledge this. It's brought up that it was the magic set in place by the Emperor over the sea, which is he's never really talked about as anything other than Aslan's father. But he's obviously the god of this
world.
Narnia
and all
world.
Worlds, really, from what we see. And there's no way you can go back against that magic and what was set up.
It is the magic that was put in place at the beginning of time. So it is one of the fundamental laws of the world of Narnia that this has to happen.
Yep. So Aslan ends up striking a deal with the witch and saying, basically, even though he doesn't disclose it right away to everybody, what he says is that he is willing to give his life in place of Edmund. And so he does that. He's actually killed by the witch.
On the stone table.
On the stone table.
Because this symbol of the
law, it actually had the magic written into it. And the death sentence that was supposed to be enacted. And so he dies on the table, but he doesn't stay dead. He knows of a deeper magic that came even before that table was brought into existence, and he actually, because of his act of sacrifice, the deeper magic from before time undoes the death, because he was an innocent person sacrificing on behalf of the guilty. So Aslan comes back to life, and then in his renewed state, his brought back to life state, he goes with the girls who had seen all this happen, Lucy and Susan, and they go back to meet with the others, and then they battle against the queen. After the queen is defeated, the children are then crowned as kings and queens, and they reign over Narnia for, according to my book, about 14 years.
Such a long reign.
I thought it was longer than that, but my official chronology really ruined it for me, and apparently it was 14 years, which I guess to kids would seem like a long time.
So
but
they're gone for a while, but then this white stag appears to them, and they go to hunt it, and it leads them back through the wardrobe.
Yes.
Into
They
their
see
own
this
world.
lamppost again, and they wonder, that looks awfully interesting and familiar. And then they end up getting brought by chasing the white stag back into the wardrobe.
At the moment they left.
At pretty much the hour they left.
Which must have been very confusing.
And
it almost sounds like they didn't even remember any of
every time they're in one world, the other world's like a dream to them. Yeah. So there's pretty much the end of the story, except they feel the need to tell the professor, and like I said, he does believe them. And he also says, though, that they won't get back in through that particular entrance into Narnia, but they will probably get back into Narnia, he believes, some other way. Hint, hint. There's more books, more stories coming.
Kind of raises the question, how does he know this? Because we only see him ever go to Narnia one time. So are there like all these adventures that he had that we just don't know about?
He is C.S. Lewis telling, I'm going to write more books, keep reading.
Yes, but there's got to be some kind of like thing in between here. Like, it'd be awesome if he had gone to Narnia.
You need to write a backstory for why Diggory knows that the kids are going to go back.
Dear.
All right, we want to talk now about some teaching themes, things that are being taught in this story, because that's one reason C.S. Lewis wrote these books.
Mm-hmm.
People don't always know that, but as we've said before, he was a Christian, he had a Christian worldview, and that really comes out in his stories. He's not trying to beat people over the head with these things, but he is conveying important truths, and he wants people, especially children, to discover them and find out, wow, these are actually things that are in the Bible.
And you know, I've actually heard several people say they think that the Chronicles of Narnia books are unwholesome for children because they contain Christian values. They say they're disturbing and inappropriate, and that they should be banned from schools, and that our kids aren't going to read them because
you should get rid of them and just read Harry Potter.
Which we need to have a video about that.
Okay.
At some future time.
Yeah, that's a spoiler.
Coming sometime in the future.
That's
it's not really a spoiler since we haven't done it yet.
Diggory would say, there's more to come.
There's more to come.
So let's talk about some of the teaching themes in this book. First of all, of course, there's temptation. And this has really been tempting me the whole time. But
you
again,
lose your soul.
The witch is at it again, tempting. And she tempts Edmund in this story. And Edmund succumbs to the temptation. He eats the Turkish delight, and it really begins to... He already had a tendency to be bitter toward his siblings, but now that he succumbs to the temptation...
He's pretty much instantly willing to betray them all for candy.
So I think the succumbing to the temptation shows that, first of all, in our world even, and we see that in the Bible, there is this temptation to do evil, and it has an effect on our nature. When we succumb to it, it actually degrades our nature, and we move. And you see that a lot in C.S. Lewis's writing. It moves you toward this negative downward spiral that eventually makes you a worse and worse person.
And the White Witch seems really beautiful and powerful at first, and she seems like she's just the ants or whatever.
And the Turkish delight tastes so good at first.
She offers him rooms full of this Turkish delight and offers him power and some that if she'll do what he says. And he thinks it sounds great at first, but then as soon as he says something she doesn't like, he sees the really nasty side of it.
Yeah.
And he is rescued in the end by Aslan, who he thought was just not nice. He wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with him.
Right, but while he's in that temptation and succumbing to it, he's very miserable, actually, even though he's immediately getting satisfied by what he's eating and what he's getting from the witch. And she even appeals to his pride and says, I'll make you a king, and your brothers or your brother and sisters can serve you. But it ultimately makes him miserable. What a great analogy
he's done eating the Turkish delight.
Yeah,
he's
already started to
feel anymore.
Yeah.
And then the witch tells him it only works once.
Bummer. Another teaching theme is about Aslan himself. You see in this story, as soon as he enters, that he has such power and authority. And as soon as he even enters the land of Narnia, he's been gone for some time, but as soon as he comes back, a new spring begins to arrive, and everything begins to come alive again. The snow immediately begins to melt, and we begin to see plant life springing forth again.
And the witch's sleigh starts to not walk or go very well, so they have to walk. They kind of... It removes just her ability to gracefully move around all elegantly just by him coming. She has to lower herself to walking on the ground.
Yeah, and I think it's a great analogy of what we see when Jesus appears, and Aslan represents Jesus. When Jesus appears, you see that the powers of darkness, their power is starting to wane because Jesus has arrived on the scene, and he has so much power over the demons, over the powers of darkness, and we see the same thing with Aslan. Another teaching theme? The law and death, the deep magic that said you had to die when you committed an act of treachery against the power of goodness.
Which is pretty obvious parallel to the law of death in the Bible.
Because we have that in the Bible, that the wages of sin, which is an act of treachery against God, is death. And that's not the end of it, though, because not only is there the law of death, there's something else that happens in this story.
There's the deeper magic.
Yeah.
There's the law that Aslan could give himself as a substitute for the one who would have to die, and if he took it upon himself, that the death would be undone. And he refers to it as a deeper magic, one that was put in place before time, I think it was. Which points to the provision for grace was put into place before the law of death was even. So the grace was thought of before the punishment was.
So what do you think the lion dying on a stone table and then coming back to life because of his act of sacrifice could possibly represent in Christian terms? I'm thinking maybe it has something to do with the death of Jesus on the cross. He dies on a cross, and 3 days later he rises again. And the first people to see Jesus when he rises again, or to see the empty tomb, are these women that have followed him. And it's interesting because in the Chronicles of Narnia, the girls, Lucy and Susan, are the first to see Aslan when he rises. They were there when he died, and they're there all of a sudden when the table breaks, and then they see him come back to life.
Which, I'm not sure, I don't really want to read too deep into it because I don't know exactly what he's intending, but at first there's just there's a thing with the curtain torn in two in the temple when Jesus died. It could just as easily be a kind of parallel to the table breaking, but also the stone table was what had the law written into it, and when Aslan came back to life, the table broke.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if that was necessarily meant to mean the law doesn't even exist anymore because Aslan
I think it's at least the penalty of the law. That the law said you were going to die, and now it's showing us that that law that was going to give us a penalty and we had no escape, that law has been dealt with. But I wanted to show you too in my book the cool graphic I have. So here's Aslan. He has died on the stone table. The table breaks and Aslan rises.
Such great effects.
Wow.
Replay. I just love pop-up.
Woo!
More like slide away books, I guess, in this case. It doesn't really pop out, it just kind of, yeah. But anyway, that's going to be my catchphrase from now on, so memorize it.
Another theme that we would like to bring up in this book is the theme of repentance. Edmund has committed an act of treachery. He's turned against the side of goodness. He feels guilty, but he has to be rescued first. And then once he's rescued, he really demonstrates repentance, a real change of heart. That's one of the beautiful things about this story, the change in Edmund. And he apologizes to his siblings, and but then, of course, his act of treachery still has to be dealt with. But we see a complete change, and I think it's actually at the very end of the book, or toward the very end of the book, after he fights the battle, and he's brought back to full health by Lucy's bottle of whatever that magic thing is. Then he's really changed after that. It says in there that he's really his old self, how he used to be before he went to that school where everything started to go wrong. So he's really brought back to his old self.
We get to see that in one of the future books too. We won't go into that too much right now, but we do get to see that.
What he's really like.
Yeah.
Yes. You gotta keep reading and you gotta keep watching.
Something you reminded me of is another, I think, parallel to the Bible. Edmund's ultimate penalty is paid by Aslan, but he does miss out on you could say, he kind of misses out on the equivalent of the earthly rewards. For he doesn't get one of the magical gifts from Father Christmas. Like, Peter gets his sword and shield, and Susan gets her magic horn and bow and arrow, and Lucy gets her dagger, and the tears that will eventually bring Edmund back to life at the end. But Edmund, because of his treachery, he misses out on that, which is just part of the punishment for what he did. So
there are consequences. I think that you're right. That's a really good point. Consequences, at least in a temporal sense, for the bad choices we make, and also added to the missed blessings of Christmas and the gifts. There's also the misery he has to go through in his time with the witch, and so there's the consequences of his wrong choices. But eventually he comes around, he's changed, and he's reconciled with Aslan. with the forces of good and with his family.
And he eventually fights on the side of Aslan. Not just, okay, it won't be bad anymore, I'll just need it. No, he fights with Aslan alongside his brother and everyone else on the side of Aslan.
One last theme that I wanted to talk about was how the kids are, at the end, reigning as kings and queens. And what do you know? That seems to be a recurring thing, this idea of humans who reign and rule. Where do you think he would get that, or what could he possibly be pointing to about reigning? And of course, I think that Christian worldview comes out where he thinks of humans as having the ultimate right as humans to reign and to rule, as being made in the image of God and having authority over the earth. And that's what the Bible says.
And you see that through all the Narnia books. In every book, there's really wise centaurs, there's really powerful giants, there's all these magical creatures you might think would be better for this way or another, but they always say, no, Aslan said it was a human who would reign on the throne.
A son of Adam and a daughter of Eve.
You see that, especially, it's a pretty hard point in Prince Caspian, which we will talk about in the future.
That's right. We're just trying to whet your appetite for coming episodes.
And that's how it ties in with our next book, Prince Caspian, is you will see the recurrence of the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve reigning, and you'll see the return of our characters from today into Narnia. Although they'll be in for a bit of a surprise, because things have changed.
Now, one last thing that I thought would be fun to do is just for Taylor and I to share some takeaways from this book. Lessons that are very important to learn. First of all, as is made so clear and so eloquently in this book, it is very foolish to shut oneself into a wardrobe. Never do that. He makes that point repeatedly. I think he's just trying to cover himself against legal prosecution. Because someone's going to
responsible for your children locking themselves in a wardrobe.
Right, so he really repeats that over and over. Make sure you don't. The only one who does shut himself in actually is Edmund. Hint, hint, kids, only bad little boys.
And it says right in the book, he knew very well that this was a stupid thing to do, but he did it anyway.
Takeaway number 2.
You probably shouldn't take candy from strangers. If a stranger gets out of his or her vehicle and offers you candy to come on a magical ride with him or her.
Even if it's a snow sledge.
Even a snow sledge.
With reindeer. Don't take it.
Especially with reindeer, I think. That might be even a bigger tip-off.
And Turkish Delight is offered to you. Yeah. By the way, this Turkish Delight, I was able to find it. I couldn't find Enchanted Turkish Delight.
Yeah, it's just hard to find.
It's really hard to find. But I found at least...
You can only make it once, so...
The final takeaway is that ugly animals are bad.
And cute animals are good.
That's right. Because it's very obvious in the Chronicles of Narnia that if you have a cute animal, it's on the side of good. And if you have an ugly creature, it must be an evil. And that's a lesson to be learned. Definitely something to take away. I don't know really what that has to do with real life, but that seems to be the precedent in these books.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe, spread the word, and see you next time. I know we're probably going to lose our souls to the forces of evil for it, but I really want to try it, so let's just
do this. Finally! Oh, man.
I would trade my soul for this in a heartbeat.
I take it back. I think if you're going to take candy from strangers, if it's Turkish Delight, that would be the exception, but...
It's like a pecan pie in a bite. It's so tasty.
Oh, man. Gotta keep eating. I can't stop.
I can feel my soul being sucked into some other world dimension. And it's worth it. It's like caramel and toffee and butter and nuts all rolled into one eternally damnation-inspiring bite of justice.
Turkish Delight!
We'd offer you some, but then we'd have to add a waiver before you could watch the video, so it's not worth our time. Then there'd be less for us, too, so...
There's a reason they call this Delight. It's so powdery goodnessy. Of just Greatness. Greatness. Taylor, we're done with the Turkish delight, but I'm really not feeling so good now.
Me either.
I'm thinking maybe that was a bad idea.
Did
A
you
little
eat the
bit
last
would have
piece?
been.
I could have sworn there was another piece there like 5 seconds ago.
I think when we got to that 5th box, that was probably the clue we should have stopped, but